The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Windsor Castle as 10-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his grandfather, King Charles. The young prince had always been fascinated by the daily ceremonies that took place within the castle walls, but today something felt different. His small hands were clasped behind his back, mimicking the posture he had seen his father adopt during official occasions, though there was a natural ease to his movements that spoke of a child still discovering his place in the world. George had been staying at Windsor for the week, while his parents attended to royal duties abroad. These precious days with his grandfather had become some of his most treasured memories. King Charles had always made time for his grandson, sharing stories of his own childhood and teaching him about the responsibilities that came with their family name. But more importantly, he had shown George the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect, regardless of their position in life. As they approached the main entrance, George noticed Sergeant Major William Thompson preparing for the changing of the guard ceremony. Thompson was a man of 45 years, with steel-gray hair and a bearing that spoke of decades of military service. His uniform was immaculate, every button polished to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. But what struck George most was the man's eyes. They held a sadness that the young prince had learned to recognize in adults who carried heavy burdens. The ceremony was a spectacle that never failed to capture George's attention. The precision of the movements, the crisp commands, and the absolute dedication of the guards had always impressed him. Today, however, he found himself watching Sergeant Major Thompson more closely than the ceremony itself. There was something in the man's demeanor that spoke of finality, as if he were savoring each moment of a ritual he had performed countless times before. When the ceremony concluded, George approached his grandfather with a question that had been forming in his young mind. "Grandfather, why does Sergeant Major Thompson look so sad today?" he asked, his voice carrying the innocent concern that only a child could express so purely. King Charles looked down at his grandson, impressed once again by the boy's perceptive nature. "Sometimes, George, people carry worries that are not immediately visible to others. It takes a special kind of person to notice when someone is struggling." The king's words resonated with George in a way that surprised him. He had been taught about duty and service, about the importance of putting others before oneself. But this felt different. This was about seeing the humanity in every person, regardless of their role or position. It was a lesson that went beyond royal protocol and touched something fundamental about how one human being should treat another. Later that afternoon, George found himself drawn back to the area where the guards were stationed. He watched from a distance as Sergeant Major Thompson went about his duties with the same precision and dedication he had always shown. But George's trained eye could see the small signs that others might miss, the slight hesitation in his step, the way his shoulders seemed to carry an invisible weight, and the brief moments when his professional mask slipped to reveal the worried man beneath. The young prince began to piece together fragments of conversations he had overheard among the staff. Words like medical bills, daughter's treatment, and early retirement floated through his memory. George was beginning to understand that Sergeant Major Thompson was facing challenges that went far beyond his duties as a guard. The man who had dedicated his life to serving the royal family was now struggling with personal difficulties that threatened to overshadow his years of faithful service. That evening, as George sat in the library with his grandfather, he couldn't stop thinking about what he had observed. The leather-bound books that surrounded them contained stories of kings and queens who had faced difficult decisions, but none of those historical accounts seemed as immediate or important as what he was contemplating now. "Grandfather," George began carefully, "if someone has served our family faithfully for many years, and they're facing difficulties, shouldn't we try to help them?" King Charles set down his reading glasses and gave his grandson his full attention. The question revealed a maturity beyond George's years, and the king recognized the moral complexity that his grandson was grappling with. "That's a very thoughtful question, George. What kind of help were you thinking of?" George struggled to articulate the feelings that were stirring within him. He had been raised with privilege and comfort, never wanting for anything, but he was beginning to understand that not everyone shared his advantages. The idea that someone who had dedicated their life to serving his family could be struggling seemed fundamentally wrong to him. "I don't know exactly," George admitted, "but it doesn't seem fair that someone who has given so much should have to worry about taking care of their family." The sincerity in his grandson's voice moved King Charles deeply. Here was a young boy who could have easily remained insulated from the real-world concerns of the people who served his family. But instead, he was demonstrating an empathy and awareness that spoke to his character. As the evening wore on, George found himself making a decision that would surprise everyone around him. He had access to his own funds, money that had been set aside for his education and future needs. While he understood the importance of these resources, he also understood that sometimes doing the right thing required sacrifice. The seed of an idea began to form in George's mind, one that would require careful consideration and planning. He thought about the upcoming ceremony the next day, and how it might provide an opportunity to act on the compassion that was driving his thoughts. The young prince was learning that true leadership wasn't just about ceremony and tradition, but about recognizing moments when quiet action could make a real difference in someone's life. As he prepared for bed that night, George felt a sense of purpose that was both exciting and sobering. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, and he was determined to face them with the kind of grace and compassion that his family had always embodied at their best. The following morning brought with it a crisp autumn breeze that rustled through the ancient oak trees surrounding Windsor Castle. George woke earlier than usual, his mind immediately returning to the thoughts that had occupied him the previous evening. He dressed carefully in his navy blazer and gray trousers, the formal attire expected for royal engagements, but his thoughts were far from protocol and ceremony. During breakfast, George found it difficult to concentrate on his grandfather's gentle conversation about the day's schedule. His mind kept drifting to Sergeant Major Thompson and the quiet burden the man carried. The young prince had spent much of the night thinking about what he had learned from observing the devoted guard, and more importantly, what he could do to help. King Charles noticed his grandson's distracted state but chose not to press the matter. He had learned over his many years that sometimes the most important decisions needed time to develop naturally in one's mind and heart. Instead, he continued with his usual morning routine, sharing stories from the newspapers and discussing the various charitable organizations that the royal family supported. After breakfast, George excused himself and made his way to his room. From a small wooden box on his desk, he retrieved a passbook that documented his personal savings account. The money had been accumulating for years from birthday gifts, Christmas presents from distant relatives, and small allowances he had received for completing his studies successfully. While the amount might seem modest by royal standards, George knew it represented something far more significant, his first independent act of compassion. The young prince had never accessed these funds before, as everything he needed was provided for him. But as he looked at the figures written in neat columns, he realized that this money could serve a purpose far greater than anything he might have wanted to purchase for himself. The thought of using it to help someone who had dedicated their life to serving his family felt not just right, but necessary. George carefully placed the passbook in his jacket pocket and made his way downstairs. He had requested a private meeting with Mr. Richardson, the castle's chief administrator, under the pretense of learning more about how the household operations functioned. It was a reasonable request for a future king to make, and one that wouldn't raise suspicions about his true intentions. Mr. Richardson, a kindly man in his 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, welcomed George into his office with evident pleasure. The walls were lined with photographs documenting decades of royal events, and the desk was covered with neat stacks of papers that testified to the complex logistics of running a royal residence. Your Royal Highness, I'm delighted that you're taking an interest in how we operate here, Richardson began, settling into his chair across from George. It's never too early to understand the dedication of the people who make our ceremonies and daily life possible. George nodded politely, but his heart was racing as he prepared to make his unusual request. Mr. Richardson, I've been watching the guards and learning about their service to our family. I'm particularly interested in Sergeant Major Thompson. Could you tell me more about his years of service? The administrator's face brightened as he spoke about Thompson's exemplary record. 23 years of faithful service, commendations for excellence, and the respect of every person who had worked alongside him. But as Richardson continued, George detected a subtle change in his tone when he mentioned that the Sergeant Major had recently requested information about early retirement options. Is there something troubling him? George asked. trying to sound casual despite the importance of the question to his plans. Richardson hesitated, clearly torn between professional discretion and his genuine fondness for the young prince. "Well, Your Highness, I understand that Sergeant Major Thompson's daughter has been facing some medical challenges. The treatments are quite expensive, and even with his pension, the costs are substantial." George felt his resolve strengthen. This confirmed what he had suspected, and it made his decision feel even more important. "Mr. Richardson, I would like to make an anonymous donation to help with those medical expenses. I have my own savings, and I can't think of a better use for them." The administrator's eyes widened in surprise. He had witnessed many acts of royal charity over his career, but this spontaneous gesture from such a young member of the family was unprecedented. "Your Highness, that's an extraordinarily generous thought, but such a significant decision should perhaps be discussed with your parents or His Majesty." George shook his head firmly. "This is something I need to do myself, Mr. Richardson. My parents have taught me that with privilege comes responsibility, and Sergeant Major Thompson has served our family faithfully for over 2 decades. It wouldn't be right for him to struggle when we have the means to help." The conviction in George's voice impressed Richardson deeply. Here was a child who understood something fundamental about leadership and compassion that many adults never grasped. The administrator found himself moved by the sincerity of the request and the mature reasoning behind it. "If you're certain about this, Your Highness, I can arrange for the donation to be made discreetly. Sergeant Major Thompson need never know the source of the assistance." George nodded gratefully, then paused as another thought occurred to him. "Mr. Richardson, I'd also like to do something more personal. Tomorrow, during the ceremony, I want to present Sergeant Major Thompson with a letter of appreciation for his service, not as part of any official protocol, but as my own gesture of respect." This second request surprised Richardson even more than the first. Royal protocol dictated very specific procedures for official recognitions, but what George was proposing was something entirely different. A personal acknowledgement from one human being to another, unencumbered by ceremony or tradition. "That's a beautiful idea, Your Highness. Shall I help you draft an appropriate letter?" George smiled, feeling a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced since first noticing Thompson's distress. "I'd like to write it myself, if that's acceptable. Sometimes the most important things we say need to come directly from the heart." As he left Richardson's office, George felt as though he was walking taller. The weight of uncertainty that had pressed on his shoulders since the previous day had been replaced by the satisfaction of taking action. He understood that what he was doing was relatively small in the grand scheme of things, but he also understood that sometimes the smallest gestures carried the greatest meaning. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine activities, but George's mind was focused on the letter he would write that evening. He wanted to find words that would convey not just appreciation for Thompson's service, but recognition of his worth as a person beyond his role as a guard. It was a delicate balance between acknowledging the man's professional excellence and recognizing the personal struggles he was facing with dignity and tact. That evening, as George sat at his desk with pen in hand, he realized that this letter would be one of the most important things he had ever written. It would be his first independent act of leadership, his first step toward the kind of king he hoped to become someday. That evening, George sat at the antique writing desk in his room, surrounded by the quiet elegance that had become familiar during his stay at Windsor. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the cream-colored stationery, bearing the royal crest. But George found himself staring at the blank page for several minutes before picking up his pen. Writing had never been particularly difficult for him, but this letter felt different from any school assignment or thank-you note he had composed before. He wanted to capture something genuine and meaningful, something that would honor Sergeant Major Thompson's years of service, while acknowledging the dignity of the man behind the uniform. The weight of his intentions made every word feel significant. George began to write slowly, choosing each phrase with care. He started with a simple acknowledgement of Thompson's service, but as he continued, the words began to flow more naturally. He wrote about watching the changing of the guard ceremonies and being impressed not just by the precision and professionalism, but by the obvious pride Thompson took in his duties. He mentioned noticing the way other guards looked up to the sergeant major, and how his leadership seemed to inspire excellence in everyone around him. As he wrote, George found himself thinking about the conversations he had shared with his grandfather about the nature of service. King Charles had often spoken about how true leadership meant recognizing the contributions of others. and understanding that even the most humble roles could be performed with dignity and honor. These lessons seemed to crystallize as George tried to put his feelings into words. The young prince paused in his writing to look out the window at the castle grounds below. In the distance, he could see the lights from the guard posts, where men like Sergeant Major Thompson maintained their vigilant watch through the night. The sight reinforced his conviction that what he was doing was not just appropriate but necessary. Returning to his letter, George wrote about the importance of family and how he hoped that Thompson's daughter would recover fully from whatever challenges she was facing. He was careful not to reveal that he knew about the specific circumstances, but he wanted to convey his understanding that everyone faces difficulties and that there was no shame in needing support during tough times. The most challenging part of the letter came when George tried to express his gratitude in a way that felt authentic rather than formal. He didn't want his words to sound like they had been crafted by palace speechwriters or filtered through royal protocol. Instead, he wanted Thompson to understand that a young boy had noticed his dedication and been moved by it. George wrote about how watching Thompson had taught him something important about what it meant to serve others with pride and integrity. He explained that seeing such dedication had inspired him to think more carefully about his own future responsibilities and the kind of leader he hoped to become. These weren't empty platitudes, but genuine reflections that had emerged from his observations over the past few days. When he finished writing, George read the letter several times, making small adjustments to ensure that every sentence conveyed his sincere intentions. The final version was neither too formal nor too casual, but struck a tone that felt respectful while remaining personal. He signed it simply Prince George, without the elaborate titles that usually accompanied royal correspondence. The next morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for the ceremony that George knew would be unlike any other he had witnessed. As he dressed in his formal attire, he felt a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that reminded him of the feeling before important school presentations, but magnified by the personal significance of what he was about to do. During breakfast with his grandfather, George struggled to maintain his usual composure. King Charles noticed the subtle signs of excitement and concern in his grandson's demeanor, but respected the boy's obvious need to work through whatever was on his mind independently. The king had learned that some of life's most important lessons could only be absorbed through personal experience. Mr. Richardson had arranged for the financial assistance to be delivered to Sergeant Major Thompson's family that morning, with a simple note explaining that an anonymous benefactor wanted to help with medical expenses. The administrator had been moved by the entire situation and had taken great care to ensure that the gesture would be received with dignity rather than embarrassment. As the time for the ceremony approached, George made his way to the courtyard with the letter carefully folded in his jacket pocket. He had asked Mr. Richardson to arrange for him to have a brief moment with Sergeant Major Thompson after the formal proceedings concluded, under the pretense of expressing appreciation for the guard's service on behalf of his grandfather. The ceremony unfolded with its usual precision and grandeur. George watched as Thompson led his men through the intricate movements that had been performed countless times over centuries of royal history. But today he saw something different in the sergeant major's bearing. There seemed to be a renewed energy in his movements, a lightness that hadn't been present the day before. Unknown to George, Thompson had received the anonymous assistance that morning, and the relief of knowing that his daughter's medical care was secure had lifted a burden he had been carrying for months. The timing felt miraculous to the devoted guard, though he had no idea of the young prince's role in his family's sudden good fortune. When the ceremony concluded, George approached Thompson with steady steps, though his heart was racing. The other guards stood at attention nearby, and several palace staff members watched with curiosity as the young prince prepared to make what appeared to be an impromptu gesture of appreciation. "Sergeant Major Thompson," George began, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I wanted to thank you personally for your years of dedicated service to our family. Your professionalism and leadership have not gone unnoticed." Thompson's eyes reflected surprise and gratitude at this unexpected recognition. In his 23 years of service, he had received official commendations and formal acknowledgments, but never had a member of the royal family approached him with such personal appreciation. "Your Royal Highness, it has been my honor to serve," Thompson replied. his voice steady despite the emotion he felt at this unexpected moment. George reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the carefully folded letter. "I wanted to give you this as a small token of my respect for everything you've done," he said, extending the envelope toward the surprised Sergeant Major. As Thompson accepted the letter, George could see the man's professional composure beginning to crack slightly. There was something in the guard's eyes that spoke of genuine emotion, as though this simple gesture had touched something deeper than mere professional pride. The moment felt suspended in time, with everyone present sensing that they were witnessing something special, though few could fully understand the depth of compassion and thoughtfulness that had led to this point. Sergeant Major Thompson held the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of something far greater than the simple paper it was written on. His fingers trembled slightly as he looked down at the envelope bearing his name in young Prince George's careful handwriting. The formal ceremony had concluded, but none of the guards moved from their positions, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that transcended normal protocol. George stood quietly, watching Thompson's reaction with the earnest attention that had become characteristic of his approach to important moments. The young prince had imagined this scene many times while writing his letter, but the reality felt more significant than anything his imagination had conjured. There was something profound about seeing his gesture of appreciation received by someone who clearly understood its sincere intent. Thompson looked up from the letter to meet George's eyes directly. In that moment, the strict hierarchies of royal protocol seemed to fade away, replaced by a simple human connection between a young boy who had noticed suffering and a man who had dedicated his life to service despite personal challenges. The sergeant major's training had prepared him for many scenarios, but not for this unexpected display of personal compassion from someone so young. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson began, his voice carrying more emotion than he typically allowed himself to express while on duty. "I am deeply honored by this recognition. Your thoughtfulness means more to me than you might realize." The other guards remained at attention, but George could sense their curiosity about this unusual interaction. He had been careful to ensure that his gesture would be seen as appropriate and respectful, but he also wanted it to be genuine, rather than merely ceremonial. The balance between royal propriety and personal sincerity was delicate, but the response he was witnessing suggested that he had managed it successfully. What George didn't know was that Thompson had spent a sleepless night wrestling with the decision to request early retirement. The anonymous financial assistance he had received that morning had eliminated the immediate pressure, but he had been questioning whether he could continue to perform his duties effectively while worrying constantly about his daughter's health. The young prince's unexpected recognition felt like a sign that his years of service had been valued in ways he hadn't fully understood. As Thompson carefully tucked the letter into his uniform pocket, George noticed tears forming in the corner of the man's eyes. The sight moved the young prince profoundly, confirming that his instincts about the importance of this gesture had been correct. He had learned something valuable about the power of recognition and how acknowledging someone's worth could provide strength during difficult times. "Sergeant Major," George said softly, "I hope you know that your service has made a real difference. The way you carry yourself and lead the other guards has taught me important lessons about dignity and dedication." Thompson straightened to his full height, his military bearing returning but now enhanced by visible pride, rather than weighed down by worry. "Thank you, Your Royal Highness. It has been my privilege to serve, and knowing that my efforts have been noticed by someone of your character gives new meaning to everything I do." Here, the exchange was observed by several palace staff members who had gathered to watch the ceremony. Word of Prince George's spontaneous gesture began to spread quietly through the castle, though the full story of his morning arrangements with Mr. Richardson remained confidential. What people witnessed was a young member of the royal family, displaying the kind of personal attention and genuine care that exemplified the best traditions of monarchical service. King Charles, who had been watching from a palace window, felt a surge of pride in his grandson's actions. The king had spent decades learning how to balance the formal requirements of his position with moments of authentic human connection, and seeing George navigate this balance so naturally at such a young age filled him with hope for the future of the monarchy. As the formal gathering began to disperse, George remained in conversation with Thompson for several more minutes. The young prince asked thoughtful questions about the guards' experiences, and expressed genuine interest in learning more about the military traditions that Thompson represented. These weren't questions designed to fulfill royal obligations, but the inquiries of a young person who had developed real respect for someone's expertise and dedication. Thompson found himself sharing stories about his early days in the military, his progression through the ranks, and his eventual assignment to royal duty. As he spoke, he realized that he was having the kind of conversation about his career that he had never experienced before with a member of the royal family. The discussion felt natural and unforced, guided by George's authentic curiosity rather than formal protocol. When their conversation finally concluded, Thompson saluted with a precision that reflected not just military training, but genuine respect. George returned the gesture with a small bow that acknowledged the equality of their mutual regard, despite their different positions in the palace hierarchy. As George walked back toward the castle, he felt a sense of completion that surprised him with its intensity. The simple act of writing a letter and expressing appreciation had created something meaningful for both himself and Sergeant Major Thompson. He was beginning to understand how small gestures could have effects far greater than their apparent scope. Throughout the rest of that day, George noticed changes in the atmosphere around the castle. Staff members who had witnessed or heard about his interaction with Thompson seemed to regard him differently, not with more deference, but with a kind of respect that he hadn't experienced before. It was as though his actions had demonstrated something important about his character that words alone couldn't have conveyed. That evening, when George joined his grandfather for dinner, King Charles brought up the morning's events with gentle pride. "I heard about your conversation with Sergeant Major Thompson today," the king said. "It sounds like you made quite an impression on him." George nodded thoughtfully. "I just wanted him to know that his work matters and that someone notices how well he does it. Sometimes I think people who serve others don't hear often enough that their efforts are appreciated." The wisdom in his grandson's simple statement moved King Charles deeply. Here was a young boy who had grasped something fundamental about leadership and human dignity that many people never understood. The king realized that George was developing into someone who would bring genuine compassion to whatever roles he eventually assumed. As the evening continued, George found himself reflecting on how different he felt compared to just a few days earlier. The experience of identifying someone's need, taking action to help, and expressing personal appreciation had given him a new understanding of what it meant to use privilege responsibly. He was learning that true leadership wasn't about commanding respect, but about earning it through thoughtful attention to others' well-being and contributions. The following morning brought unexpected news that would test the full impact of George's actions. Mr. Richardson appeared at breakfast with a message that Sergeant Major Thompson had requested, a private audience with Prince George, if such a meeting could be arranged without disrupting the young prince's schedule. The request was unusual, as guards typically communicated through official channels rather than seeking personal meetings with members of the royal family. George immediately agreed to the meeting, curious about what Thompson wanted to discuss. King Charles observed his grandson's eagerness with interest, noting how the boy seemed to have developed a genuine investment in the welfare of the people around him. This wasn't the casual interest of a child playing at adult responsibilities, but the focused attention of someone who understood that his actions could have real consequences in other people's lives. The meeting was arranged for late morning in one of the smaller reception rooms, a space that was formal enough to maintain appropriate protocols but intimate enough to allow for genuine conversation. George arrived a few minutes early, taking time to compose himself and consider what Thompson might want to share with him. When Sergeant Major Thompson entered the room, George immediately noticed a transformation in the man's bearing. The weight that had seemed to press on Thompson's shoulders for weeks appeared to have lifted, replaced by an energy and confidence that reminded George of the first time he had watched the guard ceremonies years earlier. Thompson's uniform was as impeccable as always, but now it seemed to reflect pride rather than duty alone. "Your Royal Highness," Thompson began after completing his formal greeting, "I wanted to speak with you privately to express my gratitude for yesterday's recognition, and to share something that I believe you should know." George gestured for Thompson to continue, intrigued by the serious tone of the guard's words. Thompson reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the letter George had written, now carefully preserved in a protective envelope. This letter arrived at a moment when I was facing one of the most difficult decisions of my career. I had been considering early retirement because of family circumstances that were making it challenging for me to focus entirely on my duties here. The guard paused, collecting his thoughts before continuing. Yesterday morning, my family received anonymous assistance with medical expenses that had been causing us significant stress. The timing seemed miraculous, and your letter felt like confirmation that my years of service had been meaningful in ways I hadn't fully understood. George listened carefully, maintaining his composure despite feeling moved by Thompson's words. He was learning that sometimes the most important conversations required simply being present and allowing others to express what was in their hearts. Your Royal Highness, Thompson continued, reading your letter helped me realize that my role here extends beyond the ceremonial duties that people observe. You wrote about leadership and inspiration, and it made me understand that what we do affects not just security and protocol, but how future leaders like yourself learn to see the world. The depth of Thompson's reflection surprised George. He had written his letter hoping to provide encouragement during a difficult time, but he hadn't anticipated that his words might influence someone's major life decisions. The responsibility implicit in this revelation both thrilled and sobered him. Thompson straightened his shoulders and met George's eyes directly. I wanted to inform you that I have decided to withdraw my request for early retirement. The anonymous assistance has resolved my immediate concerns, and your recognition has reminded me why I chose this career in the first place. I would be honored to continue serving your family for as long as my health and abilities allow. George felt a wave of emotion that he struggled to process. His simple gesture of appreciation had contributed to a decision that would affect not only Thompson's life, but the lives of his family and the other guards who looked to him for leadership. The young prince was beginning to understand how interconnected individual actions could be, and how much responsibility came with the ability to influence others' lives. Sergeant Major Thompson, George replied thoughtfully, I'm honored that my letter had such meaning for you, but I think you should know that the decision to continue your service comes from your own character and dedication. My words simply reflected what was already true about your value and contributions. Thompson smiled at this response, recognizing wisdom beyond the young prince's years. Your Royal Highness, that may be true, but sometimes we all need reminders of our own worth, especially during challenging times. Your ability to notice and acknowledge that worth suggests that you will become a leader who brings out the best in everyone around you. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Thompson sharing insights from his years of service and George asking questions that demonstrated his genuine interest in learning from the guard's experiences. As they talked, both participants realized that they were building a relationship that transcended their official roles, based on mutual respect and shared values. When the meeting concluded, George found himself reflecting on how much his understanding of leadership had evolved over just a few days. He had learned that true authority came not from commands or ceremonies, but from the ability to recognize value in others and help them recognize it in themselves. This lesson felt more important than anything he had studied in his formal education. Throughout the rest of that day, George noticed continued changes in the atmosphere around the castle. Staff members who had heard about his interaction with Thompson seemed to approach their own duties with renewed energy. It was as though his gesture of appreciation had created ripples that extended far beyond its immediate recipient. The young prince began to observe other members of the castle staff more carefully, wondering how many of them might benefit from similar recognition of their contributions. He started noticing the gardeners who maintained the beautiful grounds, the kitchen staff who prepared meals with care and precision, and the housekeepers who ensured that every room reflected the dignity of the royal residence. That evening, during his daily walk with King Charles, George shared his growing awareness of the many people whose work made palace life possible. His grandfather listened with evident pride as George described his new appreciation for the network of dedicated individuals who performed their duties, largely without recognition. You're discovering something important about leadership, George, King Charles observed. The most effective leaders are those who understand that their success depends on the efforts of many people, and who make sure those people know their contributions are valued. The king's words resonated deeply with George, confirming his instinct that what he had experienced with Thompson was part of a larger lesson about responsibility and human dignity. He was beginning to envision a future where his role would involve not just ceremonial duties but active attention to the welfare and recognition of everyone who contributed to the institutions he would eventually help lead. As they walked through the castle gardens in the soft evening light, George felt a sense of purpose that was both exciting and sobering. He was learning that privilege carried with it the opportunity and obligation to make a positive difference in other people's lives, and he was determined to use that opportunity wisely. Word of Prince George's thoughtful gesture began to spread beyond the immediate castle staff, though the details remained respectfully private. What people heard was that the young prince had taken time to personally recognize a guard's dedication, and this simple fact seemed to resonate throughout the broader royal household. Staff members who had worked at various royal residences for years began sharing stories of similar moments when members of the royal family had shown personal appreciation for their service. George found himself at the center of conversations he hadn't expected. Senior staff members who had previously interacted with him, mainly through formal protocols, began approaching him with genuine warmth. They seemed to recognize something in his character that promised well for the future of the monarchy, and their responses taught him valuable lessons about the lasting impact of treating everyone with dignity and respect. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the head housekeeper who had worked at Windsor for over 30 years, made a point of speaking with George during one of his afternoon walks through the castle corridors. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her warm brown eyes held the wisdom that came from decades of observing royal family dynamics. "Your Royal Highness," she began with a gentle smile, "I wanted you to know that your kindness to Sergeant Major Thompson has meant a great deal to all of us who work here. It reminds us why we take such pride in serving your family." George was touched by her words, but also curious about the broader implications of what she was saying. "Mrs. Hayes, do you think the people who work here sometimes feel that their efforts go unnoticed?" The housekeeper considered her response carefully, balancing honesty with respect. "I think, Your Royal Highness, that most of us chose this work because we believe in the importance of the institution we serve. But it means everything when we know that our individual contributions are seen and valued by the people we work for." This conversation stayed with George as he continued to think about his role and responsibilities. He began to understand that his position gave him unique opportunities to affect people's lives in positive ways, and that these opportunities came with corresponding obligations. The lesson was both empowering and humbling, as he realized how much his actions and attention could mean to others. Later that week, George made a decision that surprised everyone around him. He asked Mr. Richardson to arrange informal meetings with various department heads throughout the castle, explaining that he wanted to learn more about their work and the people they supervised. This wasn't a formal inspection or ceremonial tour, but a genuine effort to understand the full scope of operations that made royal life possible. His first meeting was with James Gardner, the head groundskeeper, a robust man in his 50s whose weathered hands testified to decades of outdoor work. Gardner had been responsible for maintaining the castle's extensive gardens and lawns since George was a toddler, but the two had never had a substantial conversation. "Mr. Gardner," George began as they stood in the main rose garden, "I've always admired how beautiful the grounds look, but I've never really understood how much work goes into maintaining them. Could you help me learn about what you and your team do?" Gardner's face lit up with enthusiasm as he began describing the seasonal rhythms of garden maintenance, the careful planning required to ensure continuous blooms throughout the growing season, and the specialized knowledge needed to maintain historic landscaping. As he talked, George could see the man's pride in his work and his appreciation for having someone show genuine interest in his expertise. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Gardner sharing insights about soil management, plant diseases, and the challenges of maintaining gardens that were both beautiful and historically accurate. George asked thoughtful questions and took mental notes about the complexity and skill required for work that many people might consider simple manual labor. "Mr. Gardner," George said as their conversation concluded, "I had no idea how sophisticated and demanding your work really is. The gardens are beautiful because of your knowledge and dedication, and I want you to know that I notice and appreciate everything you do." The groundskeeper's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Your Royal Highness, in 30 years of working here, I don't think anyone has ever asked me about the technical aspects of what we do. It means more than you know to have someone understand that there's real skill and science behind maintaining these gardens. Similar conversations followed with the head chef, the castle librarian, the security coordinator, and several other department heads. Each meeting revealed layers of expertise and dedication that George had previously taken for granted. More importantly, each conversation seemed to energize the staff members involved, who clearly appreciated having their knowledge and contributions recognized. King Charles observed his grandson's initiative with growing admiration. The boy was demonstrating an intuitive understanding of leadership that suggested he would eventually become the kind of monarch who inspired loyalty through genuine care for the people around him. The king had learned similar lessons over his decades of royal service, but seeing George discover these principles independently filled him with pride and hope. The impact of George's attention extended beyond individual conversations. Other staff members, hearing about the young prince's interest in their colleagues' work, began taking renewed pride in their own contributions. The castle seemed to operate with increased energy and enthusiasm, as people felt valued and recognized in ways they hadn't experienced before. Sergeant Major Thompson, observing these developments, felt particularly moved by what he was witnessing. His own experience with George's thoughtfulness had been the catalyst for a broader transformation in how the young prince related to everyone around him. Thompson realized that his decision to continue his service was contributing to something larger than his individual career. He was helping to guide a future king who understood the importance of recognizing and valuing every person's contributions. One evening, as George reflected on the week's conversations and experiences, he found himself thinking about the long-term implications of what he was learning. He was beginning to envision his future role not just as a ceremonial figure, but as someone who could create an environment where everyone felt valued and motivated to excel. The young prince wrote in his journal that night about the interconnectedness he was discovering between personal attention, institutional morale, and effective leadership. He was learning that the most powerful tools of leadership weren't commands or ceremonies, but genuine interest in others and willingness to acknowledge their worth. As he prepared for bed, George felt a deep sense of satisfaction about the direction his life was taking. He was discovering that using his position to recognize and encourage others created a positive cycle that benefited everyone involved, including himself. The lesson was one that would influence his approach to leadership for the rest of his life, setting a foundation for the kind of king he would eventually become. As George's stay at Windsor drew to a close, he found himself changed in ways he was still trying to understand. The week that had begun with a simple observation about Sergeant Major Thompson's demeanor had evolved into a comprehensive education about leadership, compassion, and the responsibilities that came with privilege. The young prince felt older somehow, not in terms of years but in understanding. On his final evening at the castle, George asked his grandfather if they could take one last walk through the grounds together. King Charles readily agreed, sensing that his grandson wanted to process the experiences of the past week and perhaps share some of the insights he had gained. They walked slowly through the gardens that James Gardner and his team maintained with such dedication, past the guard posts where Sergeant Major Thompson and his colleagues stood watch, and along the corridors where countless staff members worked largely unseen to maintain the dignity and function of the royal residence. "Grandfather," George began as they paused near the fountain in the main courtyard, "I've learned something important this week about what it means to be part of our family." King Charles listened attentively as his grandson continued. "I used to think that our role was mainly about ceremonies and official duties, but now I understand that we have opportunities every day to make a real difference in people's lives. Sometimes the smallest gestures can have the biggest impact." The king nodded thoughtfully, impressed by the maturity of George's reflection. "What do you think you'll do differently as a result of what you've learned?" George considered the question carefully before responding. "I want to make sure I always remember to see the people around me as individuals with their own stories and challenges, not just as part of the background of royal life. And I want to use whatever influence I have to help people feel valued and appreciated for their contributions." As they continued their walk, George shared details about his conversations with various staff members and how those interactions had opened his eyes to the complexity and skill required for work he had previously taken for granted. He spoke about Mrs. Hayes' 3 decades of service, Mr. Gardner's expertise in horticulture, and the pride that all of them took in their roles. The most surprising thing, George reflected, was how much those conversations seemed to mean to everyone I spoke with. I thought I was just being polite and learning about their work, but it seemed to affect them in ways I hadn't expected. King Charles smiled at his grandson's insight. You're discovering one of the most important aspects of leadership, George. People have a fundamental need to feel that their efforts matter and are recognized. When you took the time to truly listen and appreciate what they do, you were giving them something valuable, acknowledgement of their worth. The conversation turned to Sergeant Major Thompson and the transformation that had occurred in the guard's demeanor and outlook. George learned that Thompson had not only decided to continue his service, but had also volunteered to help train new guards, sharing his expertise with the next generation of Royal Protection officers. Your letter to him, King Charles explained, arrived at exactly the right moment to remind him why his work matters. Sometimes people need to hear from others what they've forgotten about themselves. As they walked back toward the castle, George found himself thinking about his return to his regular routine and how he might apply these lessons in his daily life. He realized that the opportunities to show appreciation and recognition weren't limited to grand gestures or special occasions, but could be found in everyday interactions with teachers, classmates, household staff, and everyone else he encountered. The next morning brought the preparation for George's departure, but not before one final ceremony that would serve as a lasting reminder of the week's lessons. Mr. Richardson had arranged for a brief gathering of the senior staff so that George could thank them collectively for their service and the education they had provided him. Sergeant Major Thompson stood at attention with the other guards, but George could see a light in his eyes that reflected both professional pride and personal satisfaction. The anonymous assistance for his family's medical expenses had removed his immediate concerns, but more importantly, the recognition he had received had renewed his sense of purpose and belonging. As George addressed the assembled staff, he spoke from the heart about what he had learned during his stay. He thanked them not just for their service to his family, but for the patience and generosity they had shown in sharing their knowledge and expertise with him. He promised that he would carry their lessons with him and apply them throughout his life. You have taught me, George concluded, that true excellence comes from taking pride in whatever role we're called to fill, and that the most important thing any of us can do is to recognize and appreciate the contributions of others. I will remember these lessons always. The applause that followed was warm and genuine, reflecting the staff's appreciation for George's sincerity and their hope for the future of the monarchy. Many of them had worked for the royal family for decades, but few had experienced such personal recognition from someone so young who would one day hold such an important position. As George's car prepared to leave Windsor, he took one last look at the castle that had been his classroom for the week. Sergeant Major Thompson and the other guards stood at attention as the vehicle passed, but George could see Thompson's slight nod of acknowledgement and the subtle smile that crossed his face. During the drive back to his regular residence, George reflected on how much had changed since his arrival at Windsor just a week earlier. He had come as a young prince learning about royal protocols and traditions, but he was leaving as someone who understood that the most important aspects of leadership had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with recognizing the dignity and worth of every person. The letter to Sergeant Major Thompson, which had started as a simple gesture of appreciation, had become the catalyst for a transformation in George's understanding of his role and responsibilities. He realized that the anonymous financial assistance, while helpful, had been less important than the personal recognition that had reminded Thompson of his own value and purpose. As the familiar landscapes passed by the car window, George began planning how he would apply these lessons in his daily life. He thought about teachers who might appreciate recognition for their dedication, classmates who might benefit from encouragement, and family staff who worked largely without acknowledgement. He was beginning to see opportunities everywhere to practice the kind of leadership he had discovered at Windsor. The week had taught him that true power lay not in commanding others but in inspiring them, not in receiving service but in appreciating it, and not in maintaining distance but in building connections based on mutual respect and recognition of shared humanity. These lessons would guide him throughout his life, influencing the kind of leader and eventually the kind of king he would become. Years later, when George looked back on this week at Windsor Castle, he would recognize it as one of the most formative experiences of his youth. The simple act of noticing someone's distress and responding with compassion had opened his eyes to the profound responsibility and opportunity that came with his position. It had shown him that the smallest gestures could have the greatest impact, and that true leadership began with seeing and valuing the humanity in everyone around him.